In today's video, I am going to show you how to go from a 2-dart bodice into a Princess Seam Bodice, front and back. To begin, you'll need a 2-dart bodice. If you don't have this, feel free to go look at my previous video where I demonstrate how to go from a single dart into 2 darts. The first thing you will do is mark the center of the shoulder seam. Once you have that, you're going to connect that line to the top of the waist dart. The next step is to mark where the notches are going to be. For this example, I've marked 2 inches up from the top of the dart and 2 inches below the top of the dart. This will later be transferred onto new paper, and it'll allow you to pinpoint exactly where those notches are supposed to be to later line up your pattern. Once you have this, you're going to cut the pattern in half, following the line that you've made from the top of the waist dart to the center point of the shoulder line. Once you've cut them in half, you're going to make sure you label them. The front piece is going to just be called front bodice. The second piece that has the armhole in it, you're going to put side bodice. Next, I'm going to work on the side bodice first. What I do is pivot the bust dart closed. When I'm doing this, I'm not overlapping any of the paper. I'm just sliding it, pivoting it closed, and then taping it shut. Sometimes I will have the paper buckle a little bit up by the bust point. It's okay to snip it a little bit so it releases. What you need is a flat pattern, because you'll then want to trace off the pattern that you have after this step, and then you'll do a lot of smoothing later. So don't worry if it looks really pointed. Once the bust dart is taped shut, you're going to take a new piece of paper and draw a grain line, making sure you have enough room on the paper to add your seam allowances later on. Make sure to secure the pattern in a couple of places so it's not rolling up on you. My paper likes to roll up because it's almost at the end of the roll, so it's pretty tight. But once you have it secured down in a couple of spots, you're going to actually open up the bust dart from the bust point, like I demonstrate here on the video, and you're going to open it up a 1/2 inch for this demonstration. For this spot, you can actually increase it if you have a larger bust, or sometimes decrease it if you have a smaller bust. But for this case, we're gonna go with 1/2 inch for about a size B cup, which is about average. Once you've indicated the 1/2 inch, you're gonna tape everything down and trace the whole pattern off. Don't forget to mark where your notches are, because you'll need to transfer them over to line everything up later. After you remove the temporary pattern, you're going to make sure all of your lines are straight and perfectly clean by using the edge of a ruler and a French curve to make sure they're all perfectly straight and smooth. The next step will take a little bit of finessing. You'll use a French curve like I have here. And you're going to want to connect that new marking, the one that you had 1/8 inch outside and inside of the seam line. You're going to connect them together, making and smoothing out the bust. It will take a few tries to get it smooth enough. As you can see here, it took me a few times of kind of fidgeting around to get it to smooth out just right. Once you have that smoothed out, you're going to set this pattern piece aside for just a moment to work on the front pattern piece. With this pattern piece, you will cut out a new piece of paper, put a grain line down and line up the center front line against the new grain line. Once you have that and you've taped down this pattern, you will then trace around the pattern and transfer the notches. Making sure to remember to smooth out all of the edges with the appropriate ruler or straight edge as you go along. Never trust your cut line from a pattern that is a scrap pattern. Mine are never perfectly straight, so I make sure to take a straight edge or my curved ruler, whatever is appropriate, to go back through each line and smooth things out. The front pattern is a very easy pattern to make. It's just tracing it off, smoothing it, and then adding seam allowance. The majority of the work is on the side front pattern piece. So once you have it all smooth and you have seam allowances, for the seam allowance, you're going to do a 1/4 inch at the neckline, and then everything else will get a 1/2 inch. That is going to be your shoulder seam, your side front seam, and your waist seam. This pattern piece for the center front will be cut on the fold, so make sure to label that correctly. Now for the side front piece and what the seam allowances will be here. So for this one, everything is the same. All edges will have 1/2 inch. So that'll be your shoulder, your armhole, your side seam, your waist seam, and your side front seam. All will have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, make sure to transfer the grain line on this and label it appropriately. So for this, you're going to make sure you label this your side front. And then the other pattern piece you will label center front. One last step that you can either do now or before you add on seam allowances is check your pattern. You make sure to walk the pattern starting from the shoulder seam and pivoting all the way down to the waist seam. If you have extra at the end of the waist, make sure you remember to consider you added in a 1/2 inch ease at the bust point to accommodate a larger, rounder bust. So for this instance, I like to walk my shoulder seam down to my first notch and mark it, and then up from the waist seam to the second notch, and then measure between each mark. If it totals a 1/2 inch, I have a correct pattern. Now on to the back piece. The back piece is considerably very easy. All you do is connect the shoulder dart and the waist dart together with a straight line. Or you can also use a hip curve and give it a slight curve. I believe later on in this video, I do end up adding a slight curve to this because it looked more like a princess seam. Once you have this cut in half, make sure to grab a new fresh sheet of paper and add a grain line, giving enough room for your first pattern piece to have seam allowance. Now that you have this cut in half, pull out a fresh sheet of paper and add a grain line to it. Take the center back pattern piece and line it up against that straight line you just put down. Secure it with tape in a couple of areas, but don't be too excessive with the tape. We just need a little bit here. Creating the back princess seam is very easy. All you have to do is trace off this pattern piece, smooth out your lines with a straight edge or a French curve wherever it's appropriate, transfer the notches, and then add seam allowance. Once you get to the seam allowance point, now that you're at the seam allowance point, we're going to add, just like the front piece, you're going to add 1/4 inch at the neck, 1/2 inch at the shoulder seam, 1/2 inch at the side back seam, 1/2 inch at the waist seam, and then for this, since we have a center back, we do need a seam here. And typically for fittings, I like to add 1 inch seam allowance. Once you have the center back pattern piece complete, you can move on to the side back piece. This is the piece that has the armhole in it. Like everything before, you're going to take out a fresh sheet of paper, lay your grain line down, and then place the temporary pattern onto this paper, securing it with a couple of pieces of tape, and then you'll trace everything off, transferring your notch lines, and smooth everything out with a French curve. And once you have traced all of the edges, you will remove the temporary pattern and begin to smooth out all of these lines you've made with the straight edge or the French curve, whichever is appropriate. Make sure to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance on all edges here. That is your shoulder seam, your armhole seam, your side front seam, and the waist seam. Once you have seam allowances on all pattern pieces and you've walked all of your pattern pieces, making sure to true up your pattern where it's needed, you're going to make sure to notch all of the notch placements. This is crucial for whenever you're actually cutting out a fabric to transfer each notch so you can line up your pattern pieces cut out of the fabric more easily. That's today's tutorial on how to make a princess seam. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to subscribe, like, and share with a friend. See you in the next video.